In the summer of 1942, the war above the Pacific changed its rhythm, though no one flying those humid skies quite realized at first. Japan had swept forward for months. Its naval aviators feared from Pearl Harbor to the jungled edges of New Guinea. Pilots trained in years of peacetime preparation dominated early encounters. Men with victory tallies painted on Zero fuselages and a code that promised death before surrender. They moved with the practiced ease of champions, sweeping aside unescorted bombers, circling slower American fighters, and cutting them down over coral seas and green islands. But beneath that surface of mastery, cracks had begun to form. The campaign for the Solomon Islands revealed how fragile supremacy could become when distance and attrition pressed hard. Guadalcanal turned into a grinding contest of supply and endurance rather than swift raids. American carriers, though bloodied at Coral Sea and Midway, still floated. New airstrips carved from jungle mud gave the U.S. footholds where none had existed. Each month, more Allied aircraft arrived. Wildcats, then the tougher F-4U Corsair, and quietly, a strange twin-boom fighter few had yet seen in combat. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning looked alien beside the sleek single-engine craft of the day. Two engines and twin tails gave it an unmistakable silhouette. Its designers had built it not for beauty, but for reach. Long range, high speed at altitude, heavy guns concentrated in its nose where recoil would not spoil aim. Some American pilots distrusted it. Many naval officers dismissed it as too large and complex. But planners at land bases scattered across the South Pacific saw something essential. A machine able to fly farther than any current U.S. fighter, fast enough to meet or outrun the vaunted Zero. While the Lightning's reputation waited to be forged, intelligence work on the ground moved with quiet urgency. Teams at Pearl Harbor and in makeshift huts on remote islands combed Japanese signals. The early triumph at Midway had shown that code could be broken, though not easily, and each intercepted message might save lives or win a day. Analysts began to map the movements of elite Japanese units in the Solomons. They learned who led the patrols, which aces escorted with formations, and how far Imperial planes dared to range. By late 1942, U.S. officers understood something sobering. Their supply convoys and new airfields were stalked by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience, men who moved with deadly freedom among scattered Allied outposts. To counter them would require speed, endurance, and an ability to appear where Japanese flyers felt safe. Pilots on Henderson Field, still rough with pierced steel planking and muddy perimeters, caught first glimpses of the new aircraft as small detachments ferried in. P-38s gleamed silver in the equatorial sun, their propellers biting the heavy air as ground crews learned their quirks. Twin Allison engines promised nearly 400 miles per hour. Turbo superchargers, carefully shielded, gave them altitude performance unusual for a Pacific fighter. Range figures written on chalkboard seemed almost unbelievable, long enough to escort bombers deep into enemy waters or surprise lone formations used to owning the sky. Quietly, without fanfare, the equation above the Pacific was shifting. For Japan, the signs were harder to read, but no less real. Replacement pilots arriving at forward fields lacked the depth of training that early war veterans carried. Fuel and maintenance grew harder to guarantee across thousands of miles of contested sea. Zero still turned tight and climbed eagerly, but encounters with tougher Allied planes now sometimes ended evenly or worse. Intelligence officers noted new American machines, but underestimated their numbers and potential reach. Confidence remained high. Victories still came often. Yet in mess huts and briefing rooms, some older flyers remarked on the stubbornness of the enemy and the faint but steady arrival of better equipment. By the first months of 1943, these currents converged. The United States was learning to marry information with technology, using broken codes to predict where to strike and aircraft able to get there. The P-38, though untested in grand encounters, offered a weapon with possibilities few Japanese planners imagined. It could range far over open ocean, carry heavy firepower to meet any escort, and return home while others would run dry. Against an enemy built on audacity and short, sharp blows, the quiet arrival of endurance and planning promised a new kind of threat. The skies that had once belonged to Japan alone were no longer so certain, and somewhere in those humid archipelagos the stage was being set for a single mission that would reveal just how far and how fast America's reach could now extend. He was known by name even to those who had never seen the ocean. Newspapers printed his photograph beside headlines celebrating victories at Pearl Harbor and the long march across Asia. To Japan's fighting men, he embodied what a warrior could be: cool under fire, graceful in combat, untouchable. Among the airmen of the Imperial Navy, that reputation was more than pride. It was armor. In the early months of the Pacific War, pilots like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and others had achieved scores of aerial victories. Sometimes in a single sortie, they flew the Mitsubishi A6M0 with an ease that astonished both friend and foe, their machines nimble and long-legged enough to seem supernatural to Allied crews still struggling with older models. At the heart of this culture stood a larger idea: Bushido, the way of the warrior. Centuries of samurai tradition had been repurposed for the empire's modern soldiers, teaching that life meant little compared to honor and service. For aviators, that creed carried an additional weight. Survival was not cowardice, but to be shot down or captured invited shame. Death in battle was a clean accounting. These ideals have been woven into training from the first day a cadet donned a flight suit. When men like Nishizawa danced through dogfights with seemingly impossible agility, they weren't only fighting with skill. They believed each move expressed a living code, one that bound an ancestors and emperor alike. The Imperial Japanese Navy invested heavily in these pilots. Training was long and exacting. Candidates washed out under grueling physical tests and relentless technical instruction. Those who remained flew for thousands of hours before combat, mastering navigation over trackless sea and complex gunnery against moving targets. When war came, the results seemed to vindicate every sacrifice. Over Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines, these airmen tore through defending fighters. In Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, they swept Allied air cover side and left invasion convoys almost untouched. They were few, but they seemed unstoppable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, knew how to wield such men. He understood morale as well as strategy. When he traveled among forward bases, his arrival signaled both scrutiny and encouragement. His inspection flights were escorted by the best, veteran Zero pilots who had survived from the opening strikes and built reputations on daring and precision. They were protective shadows around a figure the nation could not afford to lose. Stories circulated among the ranks about his presence and their skill, that enemy fighters turned away when they saw certain tail numbers, that even when outnumbered the escorts never let harm come near him. These flyers were more than individuals. They were symbols. Newspapers recounted their victories with poetic flair, turning aerial duels into modern samurai epics. Children learned their names at school. Families prayed for their safety and believed their invincibility was proof that Japan's cause was righteous and inevitable. Within the Navy's own halls, their kill tallies and survival through impossible odds reinforced an assumption. Technical parity might shift, but spirit and training would always close the gap. Even as American production surged and new aircraft types began to appear, the idea held that these few elite could redress any imbalance. The Zero itself fed the legend. Light, agile, with unmatched range early in the war, it suited their style. In the hands of aces, it became an extension of the body. Combat reports told of barrel rolls and climbing turns no heavier American machine could follow, of sudden dives into clouds and reappearances behind unsuspecting prey. For a year, this was the face of Japanese air power. Handfuls of masters dominating wide oceans, escorting Yamamoto's flights as if daring the enemy to try. But behind the aura lay fragility. Training pipelines could not keep pace with attrition. Maintenance crews struggled as supply lines stretched thin. Fuel shortages forced compromises. Still, to the average sailor on a carrier deck or soldier digging a trench, the sight of those Zeros arcing overhead remained a promise. The sky was guarded by men beyond ordinary reach. Yamamoto himself drew confidence from them. His travels among forward bases relied on their protection. The idea that any enemy could cross such distances and breach that living shield seemed impossible. This culture of invincibility was more than propaganda. It was a psychological foundation of Japan's war in the Pacific. To challenge, it would take not only superior technology, but also intelligence precise enough to find the right moment and courage steady enough to fly into the heart of enemy airspace. In the months ahead, unknown to these celebrated pilots and the admiral they protected, someone was listening to their schedules and plotting a line through open ocean. The men who believed themselves beyond reach were about to meet a machine built for distance and a plan built on quiet calculation. For now, though, in the middle of 1943, the legend still stood unbroken and the skies still seemed to belong to them. When the first P-38 Lightnings rolled out of the Lockheed plant in Burbank, they looked like something dreamed by engineers rather than pilots. Fighters in 1939 still mostly followed a familiar pattern. One propeller, one engine, a long nose tapering back to a single tail. The Lightning arrived with two slender booms stretching behind twin Allison engines, a central pod for the cockpit and weapons, and a wingspan broader than many bombers. To some it seemed ungainly, even unfinished, as if a single design could not decide what it wanted to be. Yet every oddity was deliberate, born from an American requirement few aircraft at the time could meet: intercept anything, anywhere, and do it at a range that defied precedent. Lockheed's team, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, had faced a clear technical puzzle. Europe's air war was racing ahead. The Pacific promised distances on another scale entirely. A fighter expected to cross ocean gaps needed legs longer than any single-engine airframe could offer. The solution was twin engines with turbo superchargers buried in the booms, devices that reclaimed power at high altitude and let the P-38 climb fast and cruise far. Engineers mounted the entire armament in the nose, a 20mm cannon flanked by .50 caliber machine guns. That choice ended the traditional problem of wing-mounted guns, which converged at a single range and lost accuracy beyond it. In the Lightning, all fire struck wherever the pilot aimed, turning short bursts into lethal streams. From the first prototypes, the airplane performed beyond most charts. Fast climbs, ceiling above 40,000 feet, top speed over 400 miles per hour. Its counter-rotating propellers canceled torque and let pilots push the throttle, without the usual tug that single-engine craft suffered. Its tricycle landing gear, odd at first glance, made takeoffs and landings steadier on rough fields. And its range, with drop tanks fitted, surpassed anything in American service, a gift of fuel space spread through those long booms and efficient engines. But pilots are conservative creatures. Many who transitioned from nimble pursuits like the P-40 or Spitfire found the Lightning heavy on the controls, its cockpit complex with manifold gauges and turbo settings. Compressibility, the mysterious tendency to shake and tuck the nose at very high speeds, haunted early test flights. Stories of tail buffeting and unrecoverable dives circulated widely. Some dismissed the aircraft as a bomber-destroyer unsuited for nimble dogfights. Army Air Forces brass fielded letters from worried squadron leaders who preferred to stick with proven types. Yet slowly, in combat, the odd machine began to prove itself. In Europe, German pilots were first to name it. Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, appeared in intelligence bulletins after Lightning units tangled with the Luftwaffe over North Africa and the Mediterranean. Its long range let escort bombers deep into Axis territory months before the P-51 Mustang arrived. Its concentrated guns chewed through twin-engine bombers and fighters alike with surgical bursts. For crews on the ground, the twin tail and howl of its turbocharged engines became an unsettling signature. The Pacific, with its wide blue emptiness, offered a different test. Here the Lightning's design made particular sense. Islands were dots far apart. Single-engine planes risked drowning their pilots if they ran dry or failed. The P-38 could leapfrog vast distances, loiter, and still return. It carried radio and navigation gear to help find invisible bases among cloud and sea. Maintenance crews found it more complex but sturdy. Battle damage to one engine did not mean certain death, and men began to trust its ability to limp home on the other. What seemed ungainly became a quiet kind of beauty. Once understood, each unconventional line pointed to purpose. Johnson's engineers had not chased elegance but reach. They had built a machine to bridge oceans and stalk targets no one else could reach. Slowly, squadron diaries began to change tone. Skeptical test notes gave way to combat praise. Pilots wrote about slashing passes where the enemy could not answer, about altitude and speed reserves that made survival more likely. For America, whose war would be fought across two immense oceans, the lightning became a symbol of possibility. It suggested that distance, the great shield of island empires, might not hold. And for Japan, though it did not yet know it, this fork-tailed shape signaled the end of assumed safety. Pilots who had believed nothing heavy and twin-engine could match a Zero would soon meet something fast enough, high enough, and long-range enough to shatter that belief. At first, the P-38 was simply another strange Allied type glimpsed at a distance. Before long, it would be the harbinger of a new reach, a weapon built for missions no one else had dared imagine, ready to stalk even the most protected flyers across the endless Pacific. In a windowless room at Pearl Harbor, the war was fought not with bullets but with fragments of language. There, rows of desks carried typewriters and stacks of intercepted transmissions, each strip of numbers and con a potential clue. This was Station HYPO, a small, secret world where cryptographers bent over paper and machines, chasing patterns that might tilt the Pacific War. Since before Midway, the unit had worried at the Japanese naval code known as JN-25, a complex lattice of numbers representing hidden meaning. By the spring of 1943, their patient work was paying off. They could not read everything, but enough of the enemy's intentions flickered into clarity to change battles. One April morning, a message arrived that froze the room. It referred to an inspection tour by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, commander of the combined fleet and architect of Pearl Harbor. He planned to fly from Rabaul down toward the Solomon Islands to visit forward units and boost morale after months of bruising reversals. The words were plain enough: times, routes, escort details. There was the movement to Japan's most valuable strategist, written in a code his staff still believed secure. Captain Joseph Rockefort, the quiet, sharp-eyed officer leading HYPO, studied the decrypt and understood its weight. Yamamoto's death would be more than vengeance. It would shake Japan's command structure and signal that no one was beyond Allied reach. Yet the opportunity was dangerous. The flight path ran deep inside enemy-controlled territory. To reach it, American fighters would have to cover nearly 1,000 miles of ocean and return again, with no carrier support and no margin for error. Word went to Admiral Chester Nimitz, then down to air commanders who understood at once how extraordinary the proposal was. No American fighter had ever been asked to fly so far, strike so precisely, and come home alive. But there was one aircraft with a chance, the new P-38 Lightning. With long legs, drop tanks, and a speed advantage, it could make the distance where other types would drown. Still, planning demanded obsession. At Guadalcanal, Major John Mitchell and his men studied maps and calculations. They knew the P-38 could do it only if every gallon of fuel was counted and the navigation exact. Pacific skies could turn blank without warning. An error of a few minutes might mean running dry hundreds of miles from land. Yet the chance to strike was irresistible. Pilots were told only that their target was of the highest importance. Few would know until later that they were hunting the mine behind Pearl Harbor. Secrecy was absolute. Orders went out under bland cover names. Flight paths were drawn in pencil and then burned. Drop tanks were checked and rechecked. Compasses and drift sights were calibrated by hand. The route would thread between islands, skim just above waves to avoid detection, then climb unseen to the interception point. Japanese reconnaissance patrols prowled those seas. One sighting could bring disaster. What emerged was Operation Vengeance, a name chosen with care but shared sparingly. To the men preparing, it felt less like vengeance than calculation. Codebreakers had given them a rare certainty, where and when an enemy leader would be vulnerable. Engineers had given them a plane to reach him. Now weather, timing, and nerve had to knit those gifts into a single stroke. For the cryptographers, the moment was strangely intimate. They had lived for months inside the structure of an enemy's mind, teasing out habits and schedules from sterile digits. Now those habits were about to lead planes to a patch of sky above Bougainville. Some felt a pang. Yamamoto was no faceless villain, but a strategist they almost knew through his traffic. Yet war demanded results, and this result might shorten countless battles. In the humid dark of pre-dawn, the selected P-38s lined up on Henderson Field. Each bore auxiliary tanks swollen with fuel. Ground crews whispered checks. Pilots strapped maps to thighs, scanned instruments one last time. Their radios would be near silent. Success depended on surprise and precision, not chatter. The sea beyond the runway was black, stars shivering faintly above. Behind the departure stood thousands of invisible hours. Every intercepted dispatch, every substitution table broken by tired eyes, every listening post strung along lonely Pacific outposts. This mission was the proof that war could be fought with patience as well as firepower. At Station HYPO, they waited for word but would hear nothing for hours. The operation would be carried out far beyond their reach. As the lightnings lifted into the tropical night, America extended a hand deep into enemy space, guided not by guesswork, but by mathematics and listening. Somewhere ahead, Yamamoto's aircraft would rise with the same faith in safe skies that had carried him since Pearl Harbor. Between them lay only ocean, and a plan built from silence and stolen words. The trap was set invisible, its shape traced long before in cipher and code. Before dawn, Guadalcanal lay under a gauze of mist and sea spray. Henderson Field, carved from coral and crushed steel matting, buzzed with a kind of restrained urgency. Crews moved in near silence, lantern light bouncing off aluminum skins as they tightened cowlings, topped off tanks, and checked the unfamiliar plumbing of twin-drop tanks. 18 P-38 Lightning sat waiting, their long wings nearly touching across the narrow field. Silver tails forked against the paling eastern sky. The plan depended on mathematics as much as courage. 1,000-mile round trip, mostly over open ocean where mistake meant a silent ditching and no rescue. Every pilot understood that, though few spoke it aloud. Major John Mitchell walked the line slowly, boots sinking into damp grit. He had drilled his men hard, but nothing in their experience matched this flight. Each airplane had been fueled to the margin, the main tanks full, the external tanks double-checked for leaks. Navigators had calculated winds, drift, and fuel burn until numbers blurred. A slip of a few gallons could mean coming home on one engine or not at all. They would fly low and slow at first, skimming the sea to stay hidden from Japanese scouts, then climb at the last moment to intercept. No radio calls unless essential. No turning back unless fire or mechanical failure made it impossible to continue. Inside the ready shack, the final briefing hung heavy. Maps were spread across a scarred table, greased pencil arcs showing distance and intercept point. For the first time, the target's name was spoken plainly. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the strategist whose presence still held the Imperial Navy together. For months, these pilots had fought against the reach of his decisions. Now they were being asked to cut that reach off at its source. Some shifted uneasily, not out of doubt, but from the weight of the mission. Few opportunities in war are this direct or this final. Mitchell's voice stayed calm as he walked them through timing. Departure at dawn, 400 miles of sea, landfall near Bougainville. Arrival time to the minute against the intercepted schedule. No room for improvisation. We get one pass, he told them. Surprise is our only shield. In the back of the room, someone let out a slow breath when the hour of Yamamoto's flight was recited. So precise it sounded almost unreal, a gift from unseen cryptographers. But gifts demanded perfection. As the first hint of light crept over the jungle, the pilots strapped in. Engines coughed, then roared in pair harmony. Turbochargers spooling up to a thin metallic wail. Each man felt the weight of extra fuel and ordnance. The lightnings taxied one by one, tails shimmering with exhaust. At Mitchell's signal, they lifted off, wheels tucking away, silver arrows slipping low over the breakers before climbing just enough to clear the island's green spine. Behind them, Henderson shrank to a scratch on the sea. For the next hours, they flew in a world stripped to essentials. Horizon, compass, engine note, the dark heave of water beneath. They could not climb high or risk being spotted. They held course at treetop height when crossing scattered islets, trusting the calculations made in that hot tent the night before. Each mile drained fuel and added weight to the decision. There was no place to land, no ship to pick them up if something failed. Occasionally, one pilot glanced sideways at the strange silhouette of another lightning. Long booms, fuel tanks bulging under the wings, props biting steady. They were alone out here, but also part of a pattern traced long before in Codebreaker's rooms. At designated points, Mitchell checked heading and speed. Small adjustments kept the formation aligned with an enemy schedule written half a world away. Hours in, the smell of fuel and sea-filled cockpits, sweat pooled under flight suits. It was quiet work, unglamorous compared to dogfights. Yet every minute carried them closer to a single intersection of time and space. Some tried not to think about the man they hunted. Others could not help imagining Pearl Harbor smoke and burning decks. Personal memories mixed with cold duty. When the calculated moment came, Mitchell's voice broke the radio silence for a heartbeat. A terse reminder: prepare to climb. Throttles advanced. Turbos shrieked softly as the formation rose from the ocean skin. The sea fell away until the world turned to cloud and sun, horizon distant and clean. Out there somewhere, punctual to the minute by all Japanese habit, would be a flight of bombers and Zeros bearing their prize. It was a strange kind of waiting now. Long hours of featureless water, giving way to a few final miles filled with tension. So sharp, it was almost physical. They had burned toward this line, with everything planned to the gallon and the second. Soon it would be fighting, but for this heartbeat the mission was pure calculation, quiet and exact. Behind them, the Pacific stretched endless and indifferent. Ahead, invisible yet certain, a convoy of aircraft moved into the trap they had built with patience and code and daring. The impossible flight was almost complete, and the moment it was meant to deliver hung just beyond sight. The sea below was a pane of hammered blue, its calm broken only by the wake of an occasional reef. For hours the lightnings had run just above that surface, engines droning a measured rhythm. Then, as their watches ticked toward the time given in the decoded message, the flight began to rise. Throttles advanced and the turbos whined higher. Each aircraft strained against the weight of fuel burned down to a slender margin. Cool air met them as altitude built, and the horizon stretched farther until green shapes of Bougainville and the smaller islands took form. Clouds gathered in broken tufts, offering partial cover. Major John Mitchell glanced at his compass and map board once more. Every calculation said the enemy would appear here at this hour, and war rarely offered such certainty. At first there was nothing but sky. Then Lieutenant Besby Holmes, eyes behind goggles dulled by salt film, caught the faintest specks low and distant. He keyed his mic with a click. No words, just a brief signal, all understood. The formation adjusted slightly, a slow curving climb to gain advantage. The shapes resolved into bombers. Mitsubishi G4M Bettys, long-winged and green, sliding above the jungle coast. Behind and above them, smaller dots, fluid and quick, marked the escorting Zeros. They flew relaxed, wings wagging occasionally, unaware of eyes above. From the P-38 cockpits the scene was almost peaceful, as if watching a migration across the endless ocean. But every pilot felt his heart kick. The codebreakers had been right. Yamamoto's flight was here exactly when promised. The Americans were high and behind, unseen in sun haze. Surprise, always rare, was theirs. Mitchell's voice came low over the radio, clipped and calm. There they are. Break into sections. The squadron split as rehearsed. One group aimed for bombers, one to keep the escort busy. Drop tanks fell away, fluttering like paper to the sea. Without them the lightnings felt lighter, quicker, their twin props bit deeper, ready to pounce. In the lead Betty, Yamamoto sat behind his pilots, dressed formally despite the tropical heat. His aircraft cruised at a steady, conservative speed, an airborne staff car ferrying the combined fleet's mine between bases. The escort Zeros had spotted nothing. Below, to seaward, the jungle-fringed coast of Bougainville rolled by unchanged. Then the first contrails gleamed, and the trap snapped shut. Lightning's dove, their concentrated nose guns already spitting fire before the Japanese could react. One Betty shuddered under the impact. Round smashed glass and aluminum. Fuel spray into air turned white with mist. Flames bloomed instantly, carried aft by slipstream. It rolled, wings tearing, and plunged toward the trees. Zeros wheeled to meet the threat, but found the geometry wrong. The Americans were coming from altitude and speed they hadn't expected. A few tried climbing turns to intercept, but the P-38 slashed through, heavy bursts cutting wide swaths. Another Betty staggered as cannon shells ripped the fuselage. Pilots inside fought to keep formation, but chaos unraveled the neat procession. In the lead Lightning, Thomas Lanfear pulled hard across a bomber's tail, guns hammering. His tracer stitched the sky, then punched through the engine and cockpit. The Japanese transport shuddered, smoke pouring from its nacelle. Witnesses later said it rolled once and plunged, pieces breaking away as it fell. Other Lightnings swept past to ensure no rescue. For the Americans, the moment was quick, almost dreamlike. Minutes of shooting after hours of quiet. Radios filled with terse calls, bearings, confirmations. For the Japanese, it was shock pure and simple. None had believed enemy fighters could reach this far, this fast, with such precision. The Zeros fought back hard once the surprise was gone, clawing for altitude, but the initiative had passed. A few brief turning duels flared. The Lightning's weight and twin engines made them less nimble, but still lethal, diving out of reach. Within a heartbeat, the task was done. The bombers were broken. The intended passengers, among them Yamamoto, no longer safe. Flames and debris marked the forest below. Smoke smeared the sky, where a disciplined formation had been minutes before. Mitchell called a rally, voice steady but urgent. Fuel was now the enemy. The Lightnings regrouped quickly, each pilot glancing back at the empty stretch of sky where surprise had lived. None lingered. Japanese reinforcements could rise from nearby fields at any moment. Behind them, Bougainville's jungle swallowed wreckage. Witnesses on the ground would later speak of fiery metals slicing through canopy, of scattered papers floating down like pale birds. Somewhere below, search parties would soon push through heat and vines to find the Admiral's body beside his shattered aircraft. Above, the Americans leveled out, silent again except for engine hum and quick fuel checks. Each man carried the knowledge of what had just happened. An interception that seemed impossible, when drawn on a map, had unfolded to the minute. Cryptographers' quiet labor, engineers' strange twin-tail design, pilots' exact navigation, all had converged in a single few minutes of fire. As they turned for the long return to Guadalcanal, the ocean stretched vast and blue once more. Danger remained. Fuel gauges dipped, and weather could still betray them. But somewhere in each cockpit flickered the sense that a curtain had torn. The enemy who believed himself untouchable had been reached. The long arm of range and information had found its mark. The first tracers tore through the clean morning air like glowing stitches, and then everything unraveled at once. One moment the Japanese formation moved with the serene confidence of veterans crossing friendly sky. The next, silver shapes dropped from above with an energy that seemed to break the day open. The P-38s came fast and hard, diving out of the sun, cannons and .50 calibers already finding range. No warning, no long maneuvering dance, just blunt, violent arrival. Major John Mitchell's division struck first, guns hammering into the rear Betty before any Zero had turned. Armor-piercing shells smashed through thin green skin. Fuel lines ruptured, and an orange flash swallowed the bomber's midsection. Men inside never had time to unbuckle. It twisted and fell, trailing black smoke across a backdrop of blue ocean and emerald coast. Ahead of it, the lead bomber shuddered as Lieutenant Rex Barber swept in low and to starboard. His Lightning's nose, heavy with weapons all aimed dead ahead, spat a solid stream of fire. Windows burst, engines coughed flame, and pieces of the right wing began to peel back. The plane yawed violently. Inside, Admiral Yamamoto's aides would have felt the sudden tilt, the shock of explosive force tearing through the cabin. The Betty rolled once, tried to level, then pitched nose down, trailing ribbons of smoke and fire that trailed across the morning sky before vanishing into the dense green of Bougainville's jungle canopy. There was no parachute, no time. The commander who had once seemed beyond reach was gone in the space of seconds. All around, the choreography collapsed. Zero escorts, scattered by the Americans' higher entry, scrambled to reverse direction. Some yanked hard into climbs to meet the attackers, but the geometry favored the Lightnings. Their dives had given them enormous speed, and their heavy bursts already crippled the central column. Two Zeros managed to latch onto a P-38's tail briefly. Tracers arced past Lieutenant Holmes' canopy as he rolled and dove away, using his twin engines to pull clear where a single-engine fighter might have been caught. Another Zero tried to press a head-on pass but broke too late, reeled by converging nose guns before peeling off in smoke. For the Japanese pilots, it was an almost surreal experience. They had lived through countless dogfights where skill and tight turning decided the outcome. Here there was no time for art or patience. The enemy had appeared impossibly far from any American base, descending already with advantage and firepower concentrated. Every assumption about distance as safety, about spotting threats early, shattered with each burning Betty. Inside, other bombers panic, mixed with discipline. Gunners swung their weapons upward, try and track the silver attackers, but their fields of fire were poor and the lightnings were past before sustained aim was possible. Some bursts of defensive fire stitched the air, but hit nothing vital. The Americans did not linger to duel. They struck and slashed clear, using energy to climb away, then circle back if needed. Below, the jungle absorbed what fell. Yamamoto's aircraft hit with muffled thunder, swallowed instantly by thick canopy and vines. Another Betty, mortally wounded but still under some control, limped seaward trailing smoke, then dropped nose first into shallows and shattered on impact. Pieces of wing and tail spun away across the trees. A Zero, hit while trying to shield the Admiral's plane, broke apart mid-roll, pilot lost before he could even bail. In the American cockpits, there was no time to savor or reflect. Fuel calculations ticked like a second heartbeat. Major Mitchell's voice cut across the intercom. Rally, reform, get clear. More enemy fighters could arrive at any moment from nearby bases. Lingering meant death. Yet beneath the discipline, each man knew what had happened. The great Admiral, the brain of Pearl Harbor, had been in one of those bombers now vanishing under smoke and jungle. Against all odds and miles, they had reached him. For the Japanese escort leaders still aloft, disbelief mingled with rage. They tried to organize a counterattack, but altitude and speed belonged to the Lightnings. When they climbed, the Americans slipped away. When they dove, the Lightnings rose back into the sun. And always there was a shock that these foreigners had come so far, so precisely, and struck before a single defensive tactic could unfold. Training drill for turning fights in short-range ambushes offered no answer to an enemy arriving out of nowhere with perfect timing. Minutes after the first shots, the air quieted again. Smoke columns marked the jungle where proud bombers had been, and scattered Japanese fighters circled warily, shepherding the few survivors back toward her bow. The Americans were already shrinking to specks, throttling back to conserve the fuel needed for the long ride home. They left behind a void, not just in the sky, but in the confidence of a Navy that believed its leaders untouchable. Far below, villagers and small garrisons would later hack through undergrowth to reach twisted wreckage. They would find documents and personal effects, swords and sidearms flung free, and eventually the body of Yamamoto himself, strapped in his seat among the shattered remains of the Betty. News of the loss would be carefully managed, yet the truth could not be hidden from a man who had seen the ambush. An aura had broken in an instant for the P-38 pilots. The chaos receded into the steady drone of return flight. No one celebrated aloud. The Pacific was too wide and the margin too thin. But each man carried the memory of those minutes, a hard, exact strike born from numbers and patience, carried out with a speed even they had not fully felt until it was done. What had seemed impossible on a map was now fact. America could reach across open ocean, choose a moment, and end it. The first searchers moved before the smoke had fully cleared, pushing canoes along Bougainville's tangled waterways and slipping through green corridors of palms and mangrove. Local scouts guided them, men who had seen the silver plane strike and the burning wreckage fall into forest so dense it swallowed even fire. The Japanese naval landing parties came armed and wary, expecting ambush, but the jungle met them with silence broken only by insects and the distant boom of surf. Somewhere ahead lay the aircraft that had carried the most guarded man in the empire. It took hours to cut a path. Vines tangled with shrapnel, and the smell of burned fuel clung to the humid air. Eventually they reached the first wreck, a Betty that had gone down shore of the coast. Its fuselage was torn open, engines sheared away, one wing propped awkwardly in a tree like a broken kite. The dead lay where they had fallen, still strapped or flung among the roots. Papers and personal items were gathered carefully. Anything with markings was tucked into waterproof satchels. But this was not the aircraft they had come for. Guides pointed deeper inland where a column of black had risen earlier. The second sight was harder. The bomber had driven nose first into heavy canopy, breaking apart on impact, yet leaving the tail section recognizable amid char and vines. Fuel tanks had sprayed and burned a wide patch of undergrowth, but the blaze had died quickly in the damp heat. Here searchers moved with particular care. Officers barked orders to secure the perimeter and silence curious villagers who had drifted near. When they reached the cockpit remains, the scene froze them. Inside, slumped where the impact had driven him forward, but still held by straps, was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. His white gloves were stained and torn, his uniform scorched but intact. The cap with its anchor emblem had tumbled to the floor. At his side lay the Nambu pistol he carried on every flight, and, miraculously undamaged, the long ceremonial sword presented when he took command of the combined fleet. A staff officer knelt silently, removed the sword with both hands, and wrapped it in oilcloth. Another covered the admiral's face before cutting the straps to ease the body from the wreckage. No words passed for long minutes. The weight of what they found pressed too heavy. A field medic examined the remains with quiet efficiency. There was no doubt. Yamamoto had died instantly, a bullet wound visible among other injuries from the crash. Notes were made on waterproof pads. Photographs taken with a single small camera, though officers turned away at the shutter's click. They built a makeshift litter from bamboo and parachute silk, lifting him as if still alive, careful with every step. The column moved slowly back toward the coast. Sailors carried what papers and gear they could salvage. Navigation charts scorched at the edges, charred seat cushions, twisted fragments of the bomber's airframe. All were bundled for return to headquarters. Local witnesses were warned to silence. Japanese officers left small coins and cloth as payment, then ordered the paths burned behind them. At Rabaul, the news broke first in hushed rooms. Senior staff gathered in a cramped operations hut as the reconnaissance leader reported, voice flat but strained. Confirmation was plain. The commander-in-chief was dead. For a long time no one moved. Some stared at the floor, others at the single photograph developed in haste, showing wreckage and the draped body. The silence felt heavier than any explosion. Within hours, the combined fleet's high command began to calculate what could be said. Official bulletins would report that Yamamoto had died bravely in forward inspection, his aircraft brought down by enemy fighters. Details of how precisely the Americans had found and reached him would be blurred. Yet the officers present understood something more dangerous than death. The enemy had read their schedule to the minute and flown farther than thought possible. The sea's width, once trusted as shield, had failed. Word seeped outward despite control. Pilots returning from Bougainville whispered of the ambush and the burning Betty. Junior officers asked how Americans could appear so deep behind lines. In wardrooms and mess halls, men sat quiet, heads bent over untouched rice. The legend of invulnerability, of distance and elite escort, had cracked. Yamamoto had been not just an admiral, but the living symbol of foresight and cunning. If he could be reached and killed with such precision, who was safe? That night at Rabaul, his sword lay across a table draped in black. Guards posted outside headquarters stood stiffer than usual, faces blank. Messages sped to Tokyo encrypted and urgent. There, too, shock rippled. Civilian leaders debated how to tell a nation raised on triumph that its great planner had been taken mid-flight. Some argued for secrecy, but his role was too public to hide. Instead, the announcement would come couched in honor and sacrifice, stripped of the unsettling truth that American codebreakers and long-range fighters had combined to strike with surgical reach. In the jungle, the crash sites were soon swallowed by vines and moisture. Only scattered aluminum and the ghosts of burned trees marked the place where a turning point had fallen from the sky. Yet among those who had touched the wreckage, carried the body, and stood silent around the sword, something deeper settled. A knowledge that the war's balance had shifted in a way beyond simple replacement of one man. The enemy's hand was longer than expected, its patience keener. Its machines built for a kind of war Japan had not prepared to fight. And across the Pacific, men returned to Henderson Field would soon learn their strike had landed, though they would never see the shock it sent to the empire whose skies they had just invaded. In Tokyo, the first cables from Rabaul arrived behind layers of encryption and formality, but their message was blunt enough to pierce every guard. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been killed on inspection duty in the South Pacific. The plane, it said, was destroyed with no survivors. The words were almost unbelievable, and yet they sat there in black and white, carried across radio circuits thought secure. Senior officers at Naval General Staff Headquarters read the report twice, then a third time, searching for any sign of error. There was none. The greatest sailor of the age, the man who had charted Japan's reach across the Pacific and kept the combined fleet together after Midway's shattering blow, was gone. The immediate reaction was silence. Not the ceremonial silence of planned grief, but the stunned kind that follows disaster. Around long tables in smoky rooms, staff members looked at one another, not sure who would speak first. They had lived through setbacks, Midway's lost carriers, Guadalcanal's bloody retreat. But Yamamoto's death felt different. He had seen beyond ordinary risk, shielded by planning and distance, wrapped in layers of protection and myth. Now an American ambush had reached him with eerie exactness. Questions rose at once. How could enemy fighters appear hundreds of miles inside Japanese control? How had they known the itinerary of a flight so carefully arranged? The answer whispered itself. The codes. Some officers, long uneasy about JN-25 security, muttered openly that their signals must have been read. Others pointed to the range of the American planes. Even forewarned, how could they have come so far without carriers? The thought gnawed at the room, that there might be no safe rear, no sanctuary even for the highest command. Outside the circle of admirals and intelligence chiefs, the government's propagandists awaited instruction. The Naval Ministry and the Army's own information bureaus understood the danger of truth. Yamamoto was not just a commander. He was a symbol for the whole empire, the strategist who had promised victory after victory, who had inspired trust even when losses mounted. His death, if mishandled, could break morale already fragile after Solomon's. Yet suppressing the news entirely was impossible. Rumors had a way of outrunning censorship, especially when hundreds of men had witnessed a loss or heard its echo across radio channels. Meetings stretched into the night. Some urged a simple official communique. The admiral died heroically in the line of duty, victim of enemy attack. Others argued a delay, to prepare the public for loss, to craft a story that maintained honor. The Home Ministry feared riots of despair. Newspapers, tightly controlled, would print only what they were told, but the story's absence could speak as loudly as its presence. In the end, pragmatism won. The Navy would announce that Yamamoto had died bravely, continuing his forward leadership. The details, interception at exact time and place, distance flown by the enemy, the utter collapse of his escort, would vanish into classified reports. Even so, unease seeped through cracks. Junior officers discussed the manner of his death in mess halls, whispering about impossible reach and uncanny timing. Families of the pilots killed with him began to send quiet inquiries. Men who had flown escort missions before wonder how they would defend any high official now that Americans seemed able to peer anywhere. Intelligence branches circulated memos urging urgent code changes and reviewing flight security procedures. Behind closed doors, JN-25's compromise became almost certain, though no public admission would come. The psychological blow reached deeper than censorship could hide. Yamamoto had been the rare figure trusted across factions, daring enough to conceive Pearl Harbor yet realistic about America's power. Many officers took personal strength from his leadership. Now, suddenly, they were without him at a time when defeat had begun to whisper in corners. His replacement, Admiral Koga, would have to fill a space larger than any office could provide. In private, some wondered if the Americans had struck not just a man but the fragile morale of the fleet. When the official announcement finally went out in April's last days, it was spare and solemn. Newspapers printed a black-bordered photograph. Headlines called his death a noble sacrifice in the Southern Front, and radio bulletins praised his courage and foresight. Crowds bowed heads in train stations and factories. But the text felt thin. People sensed what was missing. Whispers said his plane was surprised and shot down far from any expected combat. Some asked quietly how the enemy could know so much. Within ministries, the response turned practical and grim. Signals officers tore into encryption systems, adding super-encipherment and urgent updates. Flight plans for senior leaders became secrets even within their own staffs. And everywhere the idea of American reach grew. Not just planes, but listening posts, clever minds in unknown rooms turning Japanese orders into death sentences. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the war felt to many like a contest of intelligence and industry rather than spirit alone. Yet the government worked hard to dress grief in dignity. Schools taught of Yamamoto's selfless service. Shrines prepared for ceremonies. His body and sword, returned with ritual care, were received in Tokyo by guards who lined avenues in silence. The myth was recast from invincibility to martyrdom. He had flown too boldly to the front, refusing to hide, and paid the price a warrior accepts. But beneath the surface pageantry, officers and civilians alike absorbed a more troubling lesson, that the Pacific was no longer wide enough to shield them, that America's technology and patience could reach anywhere, even the beating heart of Japan's naval command. As spring deepened into the uncertain summer of 1943, those in Tokyo who planned the next stages of war did so under a new, sobering sky. The man who had carried their hopes was gone, and the enemy had shown a precision no one had believed possible. The return leg across the Pacific was harder than the attack itself. The exhilaration of combat had drained quickly, leaving only the steady throb of engines and the nagging awareness of dwindling fuel gauges. Each P-38 ran heavy with silence, pilots calculating every minute against the fragile promise of reaching Henderson Field again. They had dropped tanks long ago, and now only the main cells carried them home. Sweat dampened flight suits, hands gripped throttles with the discipline of habit, though every man knew a forced ditching meant the ocean and a slow disappearance. When the strip on Guadalcanal finally came into view, it was like sighting sanctuary. The formation approached ragged, stretched thin from fuel management, but still intact. Wheels dropped, engines throttled back, and one by one the Lightning settled onto matting, tires screeching against metal planks. Ground crews rushed forward, but the usual banter, the shouted relief of homecoming, was missing. The pilots climbed down slowly, stretching cramped legs, exchanging only brief nods. They knew what they had done, and they knew they could not speak of it. In the briefing hut the air was thick and still. Intelligence officers waited with clipboards, stenographers poised. Major John Mitchell removed his cap and sat at the head of the table, his face expressionless. The men filed in, filling chairs with a weary thump of boots. Coffee sat cooling on a side table, forgotten. Then the questions began. Headings, altitudes, confirmation of kills. The pilots answered flatly, reciting details like lines from a manual. They described the dive, the bomber struck, the wreckage falling into jungle. No one named Yamamoto. That name was absent from every sheet, erased from every type report. The target was recorded only as high-ranking officer. Still, in the hush of that room, the truth hung unspoken. They had been told only in hints before departure, but by now all understood. The man they had ambushed was the very architect of Pearl Harbor, the face of Japan's naval strategy. A handful of American pilots, guided by numbers on decrypted paper and carried by aircraft many had once doubted, had cut down the most celebrated figure in the Imperial Navy. And they had done it hundreds of miles from any friendly base, reaching into the enemy's confidence and ripping it apart. Debriefing ended with stern reminders. Nothing was to be shared outside the circle. No letters home would mention the mission. No tavern talk could hint at it. Loose words might reveal that Japan's codes had been broken, a secret more valuable than even the death of an admiral. The men nodded. They understood. They had flown through too much precision to think coincidence alone had guided them. Cryptographers far away had opened the path, and that path must remain hidden. But secrecy could not suppress the change inside them. Around the mess that night, voices stayed quiet. Some stared into mugs. Others scribbled notes they would later burn. Normally, after a mission, laughter rose, arguments flared over claims and victories. Now there was only a subdued weight. They were alive, but they felt the reach of what had happened. For months the Pacific War had been a defensive grind, each island bought with blood. Now, in one morning, they had carried American power deep into enemy space and returned. The Pacific had shrunk. The next day, routine resumed. Maintenance on engines, gunnery checks, navigation drills. New missions were scheduled, yet whispers spread along the base. The pilots of that long flight carried themselves differently. Their silence as telling as boasts might have been. Mechanics who had fueled their planes knew the distance involved, the gamble of fuel. Other squadrons watched them and saw the look of men who had glimpsed something larger than survival. Letters home remained vague, written under censorship, but between the lines wives and parents could sense a shift. "We are making progress," some wrote. "Our reach is longer than we thought." Families did not know details, but in their words lay the glow of confidence. For the first time since the smoke of Pearl Harbor, these airmen felt the war could be turned by precision and reach, not just attrition. At higher levels, reports moved swiftly but quietly. Admiral Nimitz and his staff read them with satisfaction, tempered by secrecy. The death of Yamamoto would not be trumpeted. The enemy must guess at the cause, never suspecting that every movement had been traced in advance. Yet among those in the know, the mission became proof of concept. American cryptography had shown it could pierce the veil, and American aircraft had shown they could exploit the breach, flying farther and striking harder than anyone had believed possible. Back at Henderson Field, the Lightning sat lined along the runway, their twin tails stark against the jungle. They looked ordinary again, metal dulled by salt and sun, but every man who had flown them on that mission now saw them differently. These ungainly machines had carried them across the impossible, through silence and danger, to a target no one thought could be touched. They had returned alive, proof that reach and planning mattered as much as courage. The men slept that night with exhaustion, but also with a quiet certainty. The Pacific was still vast, the war still brutal. Yet a barrier had been broken. Distance no longer belonged only to the enemy. Intelligence and machines had combined to create a new kind of power. And though they would not speak aloud, each man knew that the balance of the air war had shifted on the day they flew out and back from Bougainville, leaving silence in the jungle and a tremor in Tokyo that would not fade. In the weeks after the Black Border bulletins announced Yamamoto's death, a strange unease seeped through the Imperial Navy. Official portraits hung in wardrooms now seemed to carry a heavier gaze. Men stopped in front of framed photographs and lowered their eyes, unsure whether to salute or simply move past. The announcement had been wrapped in dignity, the admiral fallen while bravely inspecting the front. Yet everyone sensed a larger truth hiding behind that careful script. It was not simply that he was gone. It was the way he had been taken, far from American lines, guarded by experienced escorts, flying a route thought secret. If distance and skill had failed him, what could protect anyone else? On carriers anchored at Truk and in bases from Rabaul to Yokosuka, conversation turned cautious. Sailors who once joked freely about their invincible zeros now spoke in half-sentences. They reached him, someone would say, and no one would answer. Pilots felt it most sharply. Yamamoto's inspection flights had always been banners of confidence. The admiral among his men, shielded by the elite, reminding everyone that the Empire's arm stretched wide. To see that arm cut off in an instant was a wound deeper than any single battle. Flight leaders gathered their younger aviators and tried to restore poise. They lectured on vigilance, on new escort patterns, on scanning the sky for unfamiliar silhouettes. But privately, many admitted the problem was larger than tactics. The Americans had found a way to fly where none thought they could. Reports circulating quietly among staff officers described the ambush with chilling precision. The attackers had appeared on the minute, descending from higher altitude with perfect fuel calculation. No random patrol could have done that. Something invisible, enemy listening, code work, plan ahead guided them. The very idea of secure spacecraft, naval doctrine, once built on striking fast at long range while denying the enemy approach, faltered under review. For years, Japan had relied on the Zero's reach and the Navy's ability to choose when and where to fight. Now planners saw their own communications as liabilities. Routes once discussed by radio shifted to hand-delivered paper. Officers argued for new ciphers and tighter control of who knew a commander's schedule. The Army, suspicious of Navy competence, whispered that its rival had been careless with signals. The Navy, in turn, bristled in closed ranks, but knew the criticism had teeth. For ordinary sailors and ground crew, the impact came out as doubt. They had been taught that spirit and superior training compensated for America's factories. Yet this ambush felt mechanical in its perfection, built from production and calculation rather than luck. The sight of a twin-boomed aircraft, previously dismissed as clumsy, now carried a charge of fear. Rumors named it the two-tailed demon. It would come from nowhere and kill even the highest leader. Watchmen on distant strips were told to report any fork-tailed silhouette immediately. In mess halls, nervous sketches of the lightning passed from hand to hand. Among senior command, the loss was more than technical. It cut into the self-image of a service already shaken by Midway and the long attrition of Solomons. Yamamoto had been the bridge between aggressive strategy and sober understanding of America's power. His death left a vacuum no staff plan could fill. Admiral Koga, his successor, assumed command dutifully but without the aura that Yamamoto carried. Officers saluted, but privately wondered if any leader could hold the fleet spirit together now that even the ocean seemed porous. Tokyo's public narrative, Noble Sacrifice, provided only partial comfort. In the factories and shipyards where workers once cheered each launch, whispers spread that the enemy knew too much and traveled too far. Families of sailors asked uneasy questions when letters came home from men who admitted to fear. The tightly controlled press could not print these doubts, but they existed, passed by word of mouth and in quiet corners of shrines where families prayed for protection against enemies who could reach anywhere. Training schools responded with new lessons, evasion drills, radio silence, sharper escort discipline. But these felt like patches on a deeper wound. A generation of pilots had believed that superior agility and courage would always win in the end. Now they had seen that numbers and reach could nullify both in a heartbeat. Some veterans tried to stiffen resolve, reminding their juniors that the Empire still controlled vast spaces and could still strike. Yet each new mission carried a faint, corrosive question. Who is watching us right now? The aftershock reached even into politics. Civilian leaders sensed a brittle edge of morale and pressed the military for reassurance. They were told of new codes and better secrecy, but confidence no longer came as easily. Japan's war had been sold as inevitable triumph if its warriors remained steadfast. Yamamoto's then suggested that steadfastness alone might not be enough. At sea and in the skies, the change was subtle but unmistakable. Pilots still saluted the rising sun before takeoff, still launched with fierce intent, but somewhere inside the belief of invulnerability was gone. They scanned the horizon more often, flew with a caution that could shade into hesitation. And far across the ocean, in quiet rooms where cryptographers continued their work, that very hesitation was counted as another kind of victory, invisible but powerful. The Reach proved that Bougainville had done more than kill a single man. It carved out into an enemy built on certainty. In the weeks after Yamamoto's death, crates of twisted aluminum and shattered instruments began arriving at naval research depots in Japan. Officers in white gloves unpacked each fragment with the care given to relics, yet their task was unsentimental. Learn what could be learned. Pieces of the downed bombers were examined first, but soon attention shifted to what intelligence officers gathered from the ambush itself. The American aircraft that had come so far and struck so fast. Reports from Bougainville and Rabaul described a twin-tail machine unlike anything in Japanese service. Its silhouette was sketched over and over, long wings, twin booms, heavy nose. Pilots called it terrifying in its first pass, a hunter that appeared already in range. Technical bureaus pulled every scrap of knowledge they could find. Prisoner interrogations from earlier battles, combat reports from the Solomons, even fragments of spent .50 caliber rounds collected from wreckage were studied. The conclusions unsettled everyone involved. The Americans had fielded an aircraft with extraordinary speed and climb, yet with range far beyond the nimble Zeros that had defined Japan's early edge. Its turbocharged engines gave it power high and low, its concentrated armament, cannon and heavy machine guns all firing from a nose, produced accuracy and destructive force no wing-mounted guns could match. A single firing pass could shred a bomber or disable a fighter before it knew it was under attack. Naval designers, many trained on European models and bound by the light, agile fighter doctrine that had served well in 1941, faced a new reality. Building such a machine was not just an engineering question, but an industrial one. Japan's factories were stretched thin, producing zeros and numbers, but struggling with newer designs already in development. Turbo superchargers of the sort that gave the Lightning its reach required advanced metallurgy and precision machining Japan could not spare. High-octane fuel to power such engines was scarce and increasingly difficult to refine. Even if a prototype could be drawn, mass production at scale, with reliability over thousands of ocean miles, was another matter entirely. Meetings grew tense. Aeronautical engineers argued for heavier interceptors and twin engines. Senior pilots, still loyal to the idea of maneuver and lightness, resisted, yet the evidence lay in wreckage and in Yamamoto's empty office. Agility had not saved the bombers or their escorts. Speed and firepower delivered at long range had decided the encounter before turning fight even began. Industrial officers briefed the Naval General Staff on grim arithmetic. America's plans could turn out complex engines by the thousands, while Japan's capacity remained limited to a handful of high-performance units each month. Aluminum supplies were thinning. Skilled machinists were already diverted to warship construction. Experimental twin-engine fighters existed on paper and in tiny numbers. The Ki-61, the J-2M, later hopes of the Shurden, but nothing with the reach or systems integration of the P-38. And time was slipping away. Every new American airfield carved from coral extended their fighter umbrella deeper into what once were safe waters. Out of this came a flurry of urgent but fragmented responses. Codes were changed to reduce the enemy's insight. New emphasis was placed on dispersing flights and varying routes to frustrate interception. The Army and Navy both accelerated heavier fighter projects, but resources splintered among too many needs. Carrier defense, homeland interception, bomber escort. Each demanded speed, range, climb, but the industry could not deliver all at once. What America could standardize and mass produce, Japan could only prototype and ration. In staff papers written that summer, a new caution emerged. Where once distance and daring were counted as sure shields, planners now acknowledged vulnerability. They recommended stricter control of high-value movements and heavier, better-armed escorts when key leaders traveled. Yet these were patches on a deeper flaw. The Empire lacked the spare industrial depth to pivot as quickly as the threat required. Pilots sensed in the hangars. Zero still rolled out, beloved but aging, while rumors circulated of a Super Zero or other miracle fighter that might match the American twin-tail. Few saw one. Instead, they flew the same light machines in disguise now patrolled by aircraft with double their firepower and the stamina to chase them far from help. The old comfort that if caught over distant seas they might at least outmaneuver pursuit began to fade. Technicians studying the enemy guns noted another unsettling truth. By placing every weapon on the nose, the Americans had simplified training. Where Japanese pilots learned complex convergence and deflection shooting, an American could aim like point a finger and unleash a dense, stable stream. A small industrial insight, but one multiplied across thousands of new pilots could tip attrition even faster. The loss of Yamamoto thus became more than an emotional wound. It was a case study handed straight to Japan's own planners, and the lesson was bleak. Courage and craft could not substitute for production and adaptation. An enemy who could build complex aircraft reliably, fuel them, and guide them with broken code could penetrate anywhere. No single design change could erase that disparity. Even so, work continued. Engineers sketched ambitious twins. Ciphers were toughened. But under each new initiative lay the recognition that the balance was shifting beyond recovery. The Americans were not only catching up, but leaping ahead, turning distance into advantage and information into deadly precision. The jungle crash site on Bougainville was miles away, but in Tokyo and Yokosuka its echo lingered, the sound of industry and intellect reaching further than bravery alone could fly. The weeks after Yamamoto's death brought no pause in the Pacific War. They brought something stranger and heavier. For the first time, Japanese pilots flying long patrols out Rabaul or truck looked at the horizon and felt watched. The twin-tailed silhouette that had materialized out of nowhere over Bougainville seemed to linger in imagination even when the sky was empty. Word spread quickly despite censors. It was said that the Americans now had a fighter able to cross oceans without carriers, one that could outclimb and outshoot before Zero could react. Men began calling it the two-tailed demon, sometimes with a nervous laugh, sometimes with a glance toward the floor. Reality gave the whispers weight. The same P-38 units that had stalked Yamamoto pushed outward almost immediately. Henderson Field, now more secure and better supplied, launched long sweeps north and west. From the Aleutians to New Guinea, lightnings appeared where they had not been seen before, escorting bombers on raids deep into occupied territory. Heavy B-24s and B-25s, once easy prey beyond normal fighter cover, suddenly arrived with Silver Guardians sliding alongside. Japanese interception plans, built on the assumption of unescorted bombers at range, began to fail. In late spring, convoys moving between islands started reporting high-altitude prowlers. Paired contrails, then sudden dives and cannon bursts that set tankers ablaze or crippled transports. Before, Japanese shipping had feared submarines. Now the threat came from above, far from any expected base. Lightnings used their long legs to stalk shipping lanes at will, hitting lightly guarded barges and coastal craft, vanishing before patrol planes could respond. For an island empire straining to feed garrisons, each lost barge or freighter cut deeper than a single battle report suggested. On the ground, too, the aircraft announced itself. Airfields once considered safe rear areas began to feel the reach. At Kahili, at Wewak, at even more remote strips, alarms wailed as lightning swept in low, dropping bombs or raking park planes. Zero pilots scrambled to respond, but often found the attackers climbing away with too much speed to catch. Some who tried to pursue discovered a grim disadvantage. The P-38's turbocharged engines kept power at altitudes where the Zero faltered. Engagements turned lopsided quickly. The psychological toll was harder to measure, but obvious. In ready rooms where maps were pinned and missions briefed, the usual swagger dulled. Pilots studied silhouettes of the lightning passed down from intelligence, but admitted privately that recognition might come too late. Its first sighting was often already its firing pass. Stories circulated of comrades cut down before they could turn, of entire flights scattered by 2 or 3 fast-climbing Americans. Zeros remained deadly in skilled hands, but the easy dominance of 1941 and 1942 was gone. Command tried to answer. New tactics were drilled. Head-on approaches to negate nose guns, tighter escort boxes, steeper climb patterns to gain altitude before contact. But fuel shortages and aging airframes hampered practice, and the Americans adapted quickly, learning to use their own altitude advantage and firepower to break formations before dogfights could develop. More lightnings arrived monthly. Their production line seemed inexhaustible compared to Japan's slow trickle of new models. The reach of the aircraft also reshaped strategy. Japanese planners who once assumed wide belt of ocean as protective buffer now saw maps differently. Each new Allied airfield captured or built extended the Lightning's radius another few hundred miles. Bases at Guadalcanal, then the New Hebrides, then New Guinea pushed coverage toward the Philippines and the Marianas. What had been blue sanctuaries shrank into a narrow defensive strip. Even among ground crews and sailors far from combat, the change was felt. Convoy guards scanned the sky nervously. Mechanics discussed the strange machine's engines and lamented their own lack of comparable technology. Naval officers rechecked routing for senior staff flights. No one wished to repeat Bougainville. Fear was not yet panic, but it was steady and rational. The sense that the Americans could appear almost anywhere with warning too short to matter. For the Americans, meanwhile, the Lightning gained a quiet legend. Crews on bombers felt a new confidence when its twin tails slid into view alongside their formations. Pilots who had once doubted the heavy twin now spoke of its reach and killing power with respect. Each mission built on the last. Long escorts to Wewak, deep sweeps into Bismarck waters, reconnaissance that mapped enemy defenses far beyond previous limits. The Pacific, once a chessboard of risk, became terrain they could cross deliberately. The expanding shadow of the Lightning was not simply a product of machine and pilot. It was also the shadow of industrial rhythm. Lockheed plants and Allied fuel convoys kept a steady stream of parts, engines, and drop tanks flowing. Ground crews could keep the fighters flying day after day. Japan, watching from strained bases, saw not only an aircraft but a system they could not match. By summer's end, the two-tailed demon had become more than rumor. It was a fact shaping how and where Japan dared to move. Commanders rerouted flights, moved convoys by night, shifted resources inland. Still the long silver wings found ways in. And behind every appearance lay the memory of Bougainville, the proof that reach and information, once abstract ideas, could bring death to anyone anywhere. What began as a single ambush now lived as an ever-widening radius, a persistent unease hanging over the Empire's far-flung garrisons. The Bougainville mission was filed away under its bland cover name and locked behind security doors, but within the inner circles of Pacific Command, it was studied again and again. Every report, from the first decrypted dispatch to the fuel log of the returning P-38s, was dissected with quiet fascination. Here was proof that a new kind of war could be waged, one that joined listening and engineering into a single surgical blow. What had begun as an extraordinary gamble was already being shaped into a repeatable method. In Pearl Harbor's intelligence rooms, officers who had lived through the long struggle with JN-25 mapped out new protocols. Yamamoto's itinerary had been a gift of precision. No one expected the enemy to hand over so clean a target again. But the principle was sound. Keep signal surveillance constant, refine traffic analysis, pair each discovery with units able to reach farther and strike harder than the Japanese assumed possible. Charts once covered only carrier ranges now included concentric circles of land-based fighters, each extended by drop tanks and staging fields. The Pacific's vastness, so long a Japanese advantage, began to look like open terrain if you had the patience to plot and the machines to cross it. At Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo, pilots and navigators saw changes almost immediately. Navigation briefings grew more mathematical, fuel planning more exact. The P-38s, once experimental guests among the older fighters, became the centerpiece for long strikes. Bombers that had been forced to turn back or risk slaughter now flew under escort deep into enemy supply routes. American planners talked openly, though still behind classified doors, about reach and precision as a doctrine, not just a stunt. Other aircraft would eventually join the strategy. The Mustang, arriving later, would surpass the Lightning in some roles, but arrive into a system the Bougainville raid had proven. Codebreaking would set the trap. Long-range fighters would spring it. Coordination between cryptographers and aviators tightened. An exchange of needs and capabilities. Pilots learned to trust the invisible intelligence behind their routes. Analysts learned to deliver information fast enough and accurate enough to guide men across open ocean. The cultural shift among commanders was just as significant. Before April 1943, long-range fighter intercepts felt like desperate improvisations. Carriers were the accepted arm for deep strikes. After Yamamoto's death, confidence in land-based reach solidified. Airfields built on coral and jungle suddenly carried weight equal to mobile fleets. Engineers were ordered to push construction faster, to pave runways on islands only weeks after their capture. Each new strip meant another circle on the planning map, another radius within which any Japanese convoy, base, or leader might be vulnerable. At the same time, secrecy about intelligence hardened. The success had depended entirely on the Japanese not realizing their code was red. Commanders drilled their staffs to speak vaguely of contact reports and special information without ever naming source or method. Pilots were told again that loose talk could erase the very advantage they had risked their lives to prove. In some ways, the silence weighed heavier after the mission than before. Triumph had to be buried to preserve the trick, but the effect radiated anyway. Confidence grew, first quiet, then more overt, among the crews fighting a war that had often felt reactive. If Americans could plan and execute a strike that clean, maybe they could do the same to shipping convoys, to air depots, to any target that intelligence illuminated. Small successes followed. Sudden sweeps that caught transports unguarded, raids that destroyed supply dumps just as they filled, ambushes set by reading enemy signals rather than waiting for chance. Japan sensed the shift long before it could name it. Radio silence became stricter, but at the cost of slower coordination. Commanders moved nervously, aware that anything sent across airwaves might be a death warrant. Protective measures multiplied, But the Americans still seemed to appear in uncanny places. The fear that had begun with Yamamoto's fall spread outward. If they could find him, they could find anyone. By the end of 1943, the method was mature enough to guide major campaigns. The push up the Solomons and into New Guinea moved not just by brute invasion, but by targeted air interdiction. Strikes made possible by decrypted schedules of convoys and troop movements. Long-range fighters swept ahead to clear paths. Bombers followed under watchful escort. Each victory fed the system. New bases, longer range, faster code analysis. To those outside the classified loop, it seemed as though American luck had turned. In truth, it was calculation becoming doctrine. What had killed Yamamoto was now a playbook. Listen deeply. Choose a moment, plan the flight to the gallon and the mile, and strike so far inside the enemy's assumed safety that morale and material both took damage. The Pacific's map had been redrawn not by one ambush alone, but by the realization that such ambushes could be routine. For the pilots who had flown the first mission, the quiet satisfaction came when they saw their once experimental craft leading whole formations across waters once thought impassable. They rarely spoke of Bougainville, bound to silence, but they recognized its legacy every time a lightning rose heavy with fuel and purpose, every time new men trained to navigate 1,000 miles as if it were a normal day's work. What had begun in secrecy became the quiet backbone of an air campaign that would, step by step, close the Pacific and bring the war to Japan's doorstep. In Tokyo, the days after Yamamoto's funeral were heavy with ceremony, but even heavier with calculation. Flags lined wide boulevards, drums sounded in somber cadence, and schoolchildren bowed as his cortege passed. Official broadcasts spoke of valor and sacrifice, of an admiral who had given his life at the front. But behind the black cloth and careful words, another current moved, harder and quieter. Planners and officers looked at the Pacific map with new eyes and felt an old certainty drain away. For years, Japan's air war had been built on the idea that courage and skill could balance anything. The Zero itself was an expression of that belief. Light, agile, a duelist blade in the sky. Pilots trained for turning combat, for personal mastery that could cut down heavier but clumsier foes. Factories, limited in number of materials, fed this doctrine because they had to. Japan could build finesse faster than it could build abundance. But the ambush over Bougainville broke the story. No amount of agility had saved the escort. No bravery could erase the fact that an enemy thousands of miles away had read the Empire's mail, plotted a course with mathematics, and arrived on time with airplanes strong enough to reach, strike, and go home. In fleet headquarters, staff officers drafted long memoranda. They wrote of radios now silent because no one trusted the codes. They wrote of convoys forced to zigzag and hide, adding days and fuel to every trip. They wrote of fighters stretched past their limits, still graceful but outpaced and outgunned by machines that could cruise far higher and faster. Some memos admitted openly that the Empire could not match America's industrial scale. Turbochargers, self-sealing tanks, high-octane fuel. These were products of factories already working at a tempo Japan could not imitate, even as new designs like the Raiden or Shurden took shape on paper. Everyone knew they would come too late and too few. Among the pilots themselves, the change was personal and raw. Men who once flew with the calm of assumed superiority now returned from patrols pale and quiet. They had felt the new range pressing into what had been safe space. They had watched lightnings appear where maps said none could reach, escorting bombers to depths of the Empire that should have been unreachable. Some still believed skill could even the odds in a turning fight, but the Americans increasingly refused to give them one. Heavy-nosed guns, disciplined dives, coordinated escorts. The duels the Zero was built to win were disappearing. Training schools responded with frantic adaptation. Instructors taught head-on gunnery to counter concentrated American fire. Students learned to attack in groups, to break bomber formations by shock instead of swirling alone. Yet under the drills ran an unspoken awareness. This was patchwork, not parody. The enemy's war was engineered, systematic, and growing stronger with each new island turned into a base. Japanese courage remained fierce. It had not withered, but it now flew against machines that embodied an entire continent's industry and a system of intelligence that seemed to know their next move. Even civilians, shielded by censorship, felt the tremor. The official story of Yamamoto's death could not hide the unease that followed. In shipyards and rail stations, people whispered that Americans could strike anywhere. Families of airmen wrote letters filled with questions about safety they knew could not be answered. Factories worked harder, but raw materials dwindled. Workers sensed imbalance no poster could disguise. American commanders, reading captured diaries and interrogations months later, saw the psychological break forming. The raid had done more than kill a man. It had shown a path for the entire war. Intelligence could choose a point of contact, range could deliver the blow, and industry could repeat the process at scale. Each new base seized would be turned into another long arm. Each code cracked would map another kill zone. By late 1943, Japan's strategy bent under these truths. Defensive belts thickened but grew brittle. Every countermeasure cost fuel and time they could not spare. Carrier groups sailed more cautiously, fearful of invisible ears. Officers who once spoke a decisive battle now hedged and spoke of attrition and defense. A war meant to be swift and daring slid toward a grinding struggle Japan was ill-prepared to supply. For America, the meaning was equally clear. The Pacific no longer belonged to distance or to mythic warriors. It belonged to planning and machines, patient listening, relentless production, and aircraft that turned maps into reachable ground. The mission that began with scraps of decrypted code and a handful of nervous pilots had unfolded into doctrine, and doctrine would become momentum. In Tokyo, night meetings stretched long as summer approached. Men who had once believed in invincible wings stared at production charts and shipping losses, at requests for high-octane fuel they could not fill. They still swore by bravery, and it was real, fierce, and undiminished. But now they knew bravery alone could not protect an empire's skies. The Americans had shown a different war, one born whole from factories and cipher rooms, and that war was coming on steady wings. The rising sun still flew over vast seas, but its pilots felt the horizon draw closer each month. Beyond it waited an enemy no longer distant, no longer reactive, an enemy whose long, deliberate reach had killed a man who once promised victory and now promised only endurance. Japan still fought, but it fought under a changed sky, one where courage faced something larger, faster, and impossibly well prepared.